Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Today, we are going to talk about the theory of evolution by natural selection. And here to help us do that is a professor at Ohio State University, a physical anthropologist who conducts research on hominid evolution and paleoecology, which I'd never heard of until this morning. Professor Jeffrey McKee, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
The word theory, I often hear get tossed around as if it doesn't mean much. Oh, it's just a theory. But what does theory mean when scientists use it?
Yeah, it has very different meaning for scientists. It's quite a big thing. So people say just a theory. Well, in lay terms, just a theory means almost nothing. But in science, a theory is a well-tested hypothesis. So Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace came up with the hypothesis of evolution through natural selection. Over the last 166 years, that's been tested over and over and over and over again, which elevates it to the level of theory, like the theory of gravity. It's just that high on the list in scientific terms.
So, what is the theory of evolution by natural selection?
Well, the theory is that all life is related going back, and that the evolutionary process through natural selection and other forces of evolution, such as mutations and gene flow, the exchange of genes between populations, and things like that, that that led ultimately to humans and to everything else that's alive today. That process through natural selection, through I don't really like the term survival of the fittest, but it's okay.
Why don't you like it?
Because fitness, in Darwinian terms, implies the ability to survive and reproduce. That's all it is. And people tend to get the wrong answer or the wrong idea about the strongest or the fastest or whatever. But it's just the ability to survive and reproduce.
Darwin went on his trip on the HMS Beagle and
Right.
to the Galapagos Islands. And what observations led him to start to develop his theory?
Well, it wasn't just the Galapagos, but on the Galapagos Islands, he noted different kinds of birds and different variants of birds, in particular finches, on each of the different islands. And they had different beak shapes that were attuned to the kinds of seeds and foods that were available on each island. And so that's where he got the idea of adaptation, of very peculiar things like beak shapes.
What are some examples of adaptations? I mean, in regard to the finches and in regard to species in general.
Well, adaptation simply means, well, it's add, so toward uh, fitness. So it's toward fitness, adaptation, adapt. And so lots of things are well adapted. And once again, it's just well adapted enough to make you survive and reproduce. So with the finches, they had the different shapes of beaks, different sizes of beaks for the seeds. For humans, one of our adaptations is to walk upright on two legs.
Now,
Uh,
so in regard to, say, like, take a giraffe, for example, the
mhm.
way that the adaptations would work is that those giraffes who had the longer neck would be able to reach higher foods. Therefore, they would be surviving and they would be able to pass on their genes to other giraffes. And ultimately, you would continually, the long neck giraffes would be able to survive. It's not a matter of the animals that stretch out their necks or the giraffes that stretch out their necks get the food, and those are the ones that survive, right? This is a naturally occurring process.
Yeah, it's natural variation within the giraffes. And we have fossil record of short-necked giraffes, and we can see them getting larger or longer and longer necks. Um, and what's interesting is that uh, what they're doing is just increasing the size of the cervical or neck vertebrae. So they have the same number. They have 7 neck vertebrae, just like we do. It's just that they have bigger ones. And that is how the neck got stretched.
And what causes these changes? Or rather, Darwin noted that things would get selected based on their fitness to that would allow animals or whatever to reproduce and pass on their genes. But he didn't know, of course, about genetic mutations.
That is correct.
So I find it absolutely phenomenal that he would be able to put forward such a hypothesis without any knowledge of the underlying mechanism. Do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts on that? That just seems amazing to me.
yeah. No, he didn't know about genetics, even though genetics were being discovered at the time he was doing his own work. And so he recognized variation within species, and that natural selection could work on that variation. He didn't know that genes cause that variation, but he would see new variants come along. And he called them sports rather than mutations, and which is kind of fun because when my kids are little, I'd call them sport. They're my little mutations.
You've mentioned fitness a few times. What is inclusive fitness?
Inclusive fitness. That's not a term I use.
Oh, okay. Well, how about sexual selection?
Sexual selection. The idea there is that uh, since reproduction is a very important part of fitness, that you have to attract a mate. And so the classic example is the peacock getting this large tail to attract the peahen, and it just gets really out of control, which is known as runaway natural selection. And that large tail on the peacock doesn't give it any physical fitness. It just attracts the mate. It's actually a liability because it's pretty easy for a predator to catch on to that long tail, and it makes it difficult to fly. I don't think I don't know whether peacocks fly or not. And anyway, peahens do, um, but it's more cumbersome. But it does attract the peahen, and so that makes it more fit in the Darwinian sense.
Now, you said that the bright feathers, the big bush, it doesn't give them any advantage, but could it be signaling fitness or health to the female of the species? Could it be something that's showing that this is a worthwhile mate? Do we know anything about
That's
that?
that's exactly what it's showing, and that's how sexual selection works. Because the female is going to want the um, most fit male, well, most fit in the health sense.
To pass on the best genes, right? You don't want to be passing on shoddy genes to your descendants.
That's right.
No, there's a lot of claims by creationists and critics of evolution about gaps in the fossil record, missing links. Are there these gaps? Are they important? Do people make too much out of them?
Yeah. Here's what I tell my students: missing links. You have one species here in time, and another species here in time, and in between them is a missing link. Now you find something in between. Now you have 2 missing links. And then you find something in between those. Now you have 4 or 5 missing links. So we keep on filling in those gaps with more and more fossils. The human, or the hominin fossil record is probably the most complete of all the families and tribes of mammalians. And other animals have these um, intermediary forms as well. So the creationists are fond of saying that there are no intermediate forms, or no transitional forms. I'm fond of saying all of them are transitional forms because we're all still evolving.
But aren't like whales an example of a transitional form? Where I mean, we're talking about a sea mammal, something that swims in the ocean like a fish, but isn't a fish. Wouldn't that be an example of a transitional form?
Transitional form is the whale with legs that had been living on land and then went into the sea. And we have fossils of whales with legs.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that. Well, that's interesting. Where did
Yeah.
they
Well,
find those?
pardon?
Where did they find those? The whales with legs, and how big were they?
I I don't recall. They were smaller than the great big whales of today, but they were about cow size.
Wow,
Um,
it's interesting to me. I think you froze on me. Did you freeze up?
okay, I think it's back.
You're back. I'll just have to edit it later on. That's all. No big deal.
Okay. Yeah, my computer screen says your internet connection is unstable. So
Yeah, I get that too sometimes. How has understanding evolution eh, helped human beings? I mean, like in terms of medical advances, advances in psychology, in ways that have actually improved our lives.
in many ways, uh, for example, I teach, or among the classes I teach, one is human anatomy. And you cannot understand human anatomy and all of its peculiarities without understanding its evolutionary origin. There are all sorts of strange things, like we have a nerve that goes to the larynx, the voice box. And it starts up at the brain, goes all the way down around the aorta of the heart, and then back up to the voice box. Now, why would it do that? Well, that has an evolutionary origin from the heart being up here in early animals to as it descended down into the thorax. Um, the one of my favorite bits of evolution is that we have three ear ossicles, right? The stapes, malleus, and incus. Well, reptiles only have one ear ossicle. That's the stapes. But through evolutionary time, parts of their lower jaw got smaller and smaller, got pulled into the middle ear and became ear ossicles. So two of the ear ossicles were really originally part of the reptilian jaw. And we can see this embryologically, we can see it forming. But as those got pulled in to the middle ear and became ear ossicles, they brought the nerve supply with them. And so that's why sometimes when you have an earache, it's actually a toothache. It's because it's the same nerve, and you get this referred pain. So you might go to the ear doctor and say, I have an earache, and he'll say, no, go to the dentist. It's actually a toothache. But
Hmm.
you can't understand that unless you understand evolution.
I've read about this idea in studying the intelligent design people of irreducible complexity. What does that refer to? What is irreducible complexity? And why isn't it a problem for evolution?
Well, irreducible complexity means that something doesn't function without all of its parts working at the same time. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't come from something. So my favorite example of that is a lever is an um, irreducibly complex tool, because without a fulcrum, you don't have a lever. Without the long arm and the short arm, or whatever, the load arm, you don't have a lever. But in our evolution, for example, the evolution of our limbs in early fish and then later in other animals, starts off with just one bone coming out, which would have been a fin originally. And then you get, then it continues to grow and you get two bones, and automatically you have a lever. And so that lever where you're bending your arm wouldn't work without all its parts, but we can see how it started off very simple and then became much more complex.
Are you familiar
And
with the
so,
concept of exact? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. My fault. I thought you were finished.
no, no, you can go ahead.
I was going to ask if you're familiar with the concept of exaptation.
Exaptation.
Exaptation. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's been a while. Exaptation. Yes.
Exaptation, yes, I'm familiar with that. That's also, well, it's formerly known as pre-adaptation. And that is where a structure that's used for one thing becomes useful for something else and continues to evolve to be better for the second function rather than the original function. So our grasping hands, our fingers, in the earliest primates, the opposable thumb and whatnot, and grasping ability of the hands and the flattened nails, that was all adapted for grasping onto branches because they were arboreal. They lived in trees. And so we don't live in trees anymore, not for the most part, although my kids used to climb on a regular basis. But later, those same things that were used for grasping branches became useful for making stone tools, because you could hold the rock in one hand and hit it with another rock, and there you go. And now, so it was a exaptation for tool making, and now it's an exaptation for texting or playing bass guitar or whatever.
I read there was this famous I guess it would be a trial or a case in Pennsylvania about whether intelligent design should be taught in schools. And they were talking about the irreducible complexity. And one of the arguments that was made against it is this exact idea of exaptation, because they brought up the bacterial flagellum, because they said this can't have evolved because it's irreducibly complex. Or some people might mention the human eye, that it only works when it's in its entirety. But like you said, some things evolve for one purpose and then end up serving a different purpose. So the whole irreducible complexity argument sort of falls apart because of
Because
concepts like adaptation.
it started off much more simply. So a bacteria has a flagellum and all sorts of other things, but it took a long time to evolve. For the first billion years of life on Earth, bacteria were what we call prokaryotes. They were just a single cell. They didn't have a flagellum or anything like that. And then it's when some of the prokaryotes kind of merged together that they became what we call eukaryotes, which you and I are eukaryotes, and most bacteria with a flagellum is a eukaryote. And that's because the cells joined together and kind of took on a symbiotic relationship. Once you have that symbiotic relationship, then you can't live without it. So it becomes irreducibly complex.
Now, who are our closest ancestors? So, what came before us?
What came before us? Well, our closest living relatives are chimpanzees, but we have a common ancestor. We didn't evolve from chimpanzees or gorillas. As a matter of fact, gorillas would share a common ancestor with us way back before 6 or 7 million years ago. And gorillas have evolved more than we have. It's just we evolved in their direction. So our ancestry goes back about 6 million years ago, thereabouts, when we split from the ancestors of modern day chimpanzees. And then one of the first things that happened as we evolved was that we stood up on two legs when we were on the ground, but we were living mostly in the trees at first. And so it was only when we were on the ground that we were walking on two legs. That led to all sorts of other possibilities, because when you stand upright, then everything else has to change as well. And it changed in a step-by-step process. You know, we didn't just suddenly stand up and say, oh, look, I'm a biped. It took several steps to get there, both literally and figuratively. And but that's one thing that set us apart.
Like, what about, for instance, Homo habilis? I think I'm pronouncing it right. If I'm not, I'm okay with that. Or Homo erectus. These are our ancestors as well, aren't they?
Yes, Homo habilis was the uh, first of our own genus, the genus Homo, and that goes back nearly 2.5 million years. And they were the first ones to make stone tools. Very simple stone tools. It was just one block hit against another. But then they'd use the flake that came off to scavenge meat. So they were the scavengers, the first meat eaters of our ancestors as well. What had come before, they didn't have stone tools. And I'm talking about the Australopithecines here. They didn't have stone tools, but they were upright and had a larger brain than a modern day chimpanzee. But it's with Homo habilis that we got the tool making. And the other important thing about Homo habilis is that on the left side of the brain, there are two areas that had expanded, two particular areas. One is known as Broca's area, which is the speech area, and the other is known as Wernicke's area, which is the association area. So if I say the word bird, you know, it goes into your ear and you hear bird, and Wernicke's area interprets it as, you know, this feathered creature flying outside. And then that goes through the brain, through this long fiber, comes out to Broca's area, and then, you know, someone says bird, you can say, I see a bird, or something like that. And so those two areas of the brain were expanded first in Homo habilis. So it's probable that, well, they had at least the neural capacity for speech and language. So it's probable that they actually had language. We don't know how complicated or how simple that language may have been, but that's the first sign that we have languages with Homo habilis. That then led to Homo erectus. And Homo erectus, all sorts of things happen. We get better stone tools, we get the controlled use of fire, we get beyond Africa, and we get to our full body size. Because Homo habilis was just a short little, you know, 3.5, 4 foot tall
Really? I didn't know
hominid.
that either. I thought he was our same size as us. I didn't know they were little guys.
Yep.
Now, what about these guys out there in the Neander Valley, the Neanderthals? I've read that they have no relation to us, but I've also seen that lately evidence has come out that, in fact, we do have some relation to them. What's the truth of the matter, and how do we know?
That has been controversial since 1863, when Thomas Huxley, who was a friend of Darwin's,
It was
uh,
his bulldog, right?
Thomas Huxley was Darwin's bulldog, and he wrote a series of essays called Man's Place in Nature. And in that, he describes what had recently come out from the Neander Valley, Germany, the Neanderthal skull. And he suggested that it wasn't a separate species, but basically a cousin of ours, a subspecies. And that started the debate that went on until recently. Now we have a human genome and a Neanderthal genome, and we can compare them base point in the genes, and we can see that many humans have genes that were specific to Neanderthals, but not all humans have these genes. I, in particular, have more Neanderthal genes than about 50% of the population. So, so I've had my genome tested. So I'm part Neanderthal. Maybe that's why I became an anthropologist. I don't know. but it shows conclusively that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. We can see that in the genes. We argued about it in the fossil record because some late Neanderthals seem to have some modern human features. But that argument pretty much has ended now that we have the genetics behind it.
How could Neanderthals interbreed with modern humans? I thought that's how you can tell if things are from a different species, is they can't breed.
Well,
Are
that's
there?
the point. They weren't a separate species, they were a subspecies.
Oh, okay. All right. I got it. Okay.
They were essentially a race in the biological sense.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. Um, I've heard that Charles Darwin recanted at the end of his life, that he said that no, he disavowed the theory of evolution. Is there any truth to that?
There's no truth to that at all. It's just something that creationists like to claim.
Well, what's the source of it? I mean, did they just make it up out of whole cloth?
I'm not sure what the source was, but I've read enough biographies.
Oh, you froze on me again. You back?
Yeah,
All
I'm
right.
back.
Okay. Start over with
Okay.
I've read enough biographies.
Yeah, I read enough biographies of Charles Darwin to know that this idea that he recanted never really happened. Where it comes from, I'm not sure.
What are some of the controversies amongst biologists or amongst evolution theorists today that would be resolved in my lifetime, like things that you can look forward to finding out, if there's any? I'm assuming they don't all agree with one another. So I'm guessing there's areas in which we could get major innovations in the next decade or so.
You know, the genome projects are really what changed in our lifetimes, changed everything. So now we know that we're closely related to Neanderthals, and that, as I said, had been controversial since 1863. But um, there are sort of more philosophical arguments amongst evolutionary biologists concerning altruism, for example. You know, is there any such thing as altruism? And some evolutionary biologists say no, other evolutionary biologists say yes. I don't think that's ever going to be resolved because it's more of a philosophical question than one that can be tested scientifically. Um, Others don't pop to mind. Why is having two sexes better than having one sex? Because there are single sex organisms, parthenogenic organisms, um, but most species have two sexes. So the question is, why is that? And there are lots of arguments going back and forth as to why uh, sex is best.
You mentioned altruism, and it's called reciprocal altruism, I guess. And it seems to me that the idea of reciprocal altruism isn't altruism at all. It's just I do for you because I'm hoping you're going to do for me or somebody else. I mean, if it, as applied to people, but I mean, applied to animals, they're not putting it in those terms. But it's basically the idea that if I do something, if I help somebody, then that increases my chances of being helped in the future, or the animal will get help in the future. Is that the type of philosophical disagreement that you're talking about, is where they would disagree about whether a given behavior is actually altruistic or not?
That's exactly what the argument is about. And but you know, we can take it further now that we have language and we have communications around the world. If there's a disaster somewhere and I send money to help the victims, is that being altruistic? Uh, it could be considered altruistic. It could be considered by some, just one of those things that I do to make myself feel better.
Right.
Uh,
Okay,
But
Professor, I think we've covered the topic today. Is there anything that you think that we should have covered that we didn't?
just one little point,
Okay.
uh, and that is one of the fossil sites where I've excavated is a place in South Africa called Taung. And that was the first fossil that came out that indicated that Africa was the place of human origins. The reason I bring that up is because it was discovered in 1924 and published in 1925. So coming up, there's going to be all sorts of celebrations and recognition of the Taung skull of one of our ancestors.
Oh, that sounds interesting. That's fascinating that you've been on these excavations. Those must be fun. Like for somebody who's interested in it, it must be very exciting, especially when you find the bones, fossils, whatever. That's got to be great.
Yeah, it is exciting. It's also very tedious. It's wonderful to be out in the wild in Africa and finding fossils, but you can go for days and not find anything. Just breaking rocks, and that can be quite frustrating.
Hmm.
But all in all, my work at Taung and at Makapanska were very rewarding times of my career.
Okay, Professor, where can people find you? They want to look up your work.
Um, I have two websites now. Um, one is the riddle, no, it's just called riddlechain.org. Riddle Chain is one of my books. And for this anniversary I was just talking about, I'm putting together a website that's partially up right now called tongskull.org. And that's going to have the most complete um, information about the Taung skull and the Taung site and whatnot of any place else on the internet. So those are the two places, riddlechain.org and tongskull.org.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to talk to us. Really
It's
appreciate
my
it.
pleasure.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.